Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is the latest installment of the Career Profiles podcast. Now, before I get into this particular episode, I just want to say thank you very, very much for all of the messages of support over the last few months. If you're picking this episode up at this moment in time and you haven't listened to previous ones and this is your first one, the reason I say that is because there has been a gap of around 3 to 4 months since the last episode went out. I have explained that to those that have been following me for quite some time. So if you are just picking it up at this point, it probably is a really good episode to pick it up on, especially if you're a UK-based listener and you know all about the man that we're going to be covering in this series of episodes, which of course is the eccentric and legendary Mr. Chris Eubank. Really excited to deliver this episode to everybody listening because Chris was one of my favourites growing up. Yes, he's very eccentric. He's not everybody's cup of tea. He's not everybody's character that they enjoy seeing in the boxing world, but he certainly left his mark in the boxing world, both inside and outside of the ring. And during the course of putting the research together for this episode, there was so much I didn't know about Chris Eubank. Just when you think you know so much about a certain person within the sport, and you find so much more out. So it is the beauty of doing these episodes. I also educate myself at the same time. So without further ado, I'm going to get straight into this story. So it all begins with his father, Irving Eubank, who was actually born on the 28th of August, 1929, in the district of Mount Airy, Clarendon, in Jamaica. Now, he cut sugarcane in the fields for most of his younger years. That's where he met and eventually married Chris's mother, Ina, who was then, and always would be, deeply a religious person. She was well known in church circles in Clarendon. She had actually been married previously and had 5 children. Ina was born on the 15th of March 1931 in Clarendon, and she left school at the age of 17 and became a nurse's domestic helper. She met her first husband and then married him at the age of 25, but unfortunately he died only 3 years later, leaving Ina on her own with their 5 children. Then, in 1960, she met Irving. Irving, he saved diligently for many years for the plane fares to migrate to the UK, stuffing his hard-earned cash under a mattress until such a time as the move could be made. They then settled in South London, and life was difficult. It was an endless grind of poverty and hard work. Chris himself was born in East Dulwich on the 8th of August 1966, and that would be Irving and Ina's 5th child after David, the twins Simon and Peter, Jocelyn. And Ina told Chris that the main goal was to get their own home, and to do so with 5 kids around at the time was really hard. So, the kids were sent to Jamaica to be with the grandmother on Ina's side, when Chris was only still a baby. Chris's earliest memory is of being pulled on a banana leaf in the hills by his cousin, Woodia. Other than that, Chris says he has no recollection of his time there. His grandmother was called Constance, but he called her Uncon. When she was still alive, and Chris had become world champion, he actually hired and flew in a helicopter packed with supplies of clothes and food to Callington, the mountaintop village where she lived. And even when Chris travels to Jamaica, they say, "You're the man who came in the helicopter." Ina visited the children as often as she could, and she was always sending money over to them too. On one of these particular visits, she came with the good news that they now had a house in Crystal Palace Road in southeast London. Taking fright at how ill the kids looked, she convinced herself that the kids were malnourished. Knowing, as she did, how tough life can be in the countryside of Jamaica, she immediately rounded up the 4 boys, packed their belongings, and took them all back to England and left Jocelyn to stay with the grandmother. Chris spoke about his early life in his autobiography, and he said, "I don't remember coming back from Jamaica, but I have clear recollections of my early life back in the UK. We lived in various council estates in London, including Crystal Palace Road, Peckham, Stoke Newington, Hackney and Dalston. My first memory in the UK was of my mother slapping me senseless for pretending I had a stomachache when I actually had 4 packets of Wats's shoved underneath my coat that I had stolen from a sweet shop with her in Stoke Newington. He also said I was also quite adept at stealing from the bread van owned by the nearby bakery. Now, at first, life in the UK had been happy, and in 1974, Irving and Ina were married in Hackney. However, shortly after, when Chris was 8, his mother left his father and went to live in New York. Chris then didn't see her very often between her leaving and him travelling to New York at the age of 16. It wasn't until then that he found out one of the reasons why she'd actually left. Chris kept asking over the space of a year why she'd moved away, and she broke down and she explained the situation to him several times. She told him that when she would come in the front door, another woman would leave out of the back door. Basically, Irving was a womanizer, and she'd had enough. Chris said, back in 1974, leaving the marital home was not a decision my mother could have taken lightly, especially in the light of her deeply religious views. I think removing herself from that situation as a wife was relatively easy. What was hard was the fact she was walking away from her children. Chris states that his father Irving was quite a disciplinarian. He said, I wouldn't say my upbringing was a hard life. It was correct. We got the strap as punishment so often that I began to become quite apprehensive of him. In retrospect, I've got no problems whatsoever with him using that strap, even though I would not do the same with my own children. The strap is not excessive, but the impression this gives a child is not necessarily always good. Irving rarely gave Chris advice, but when he did give him advice, Chris said it was right. He said he was strict to ensure we behaved in a correct manner. He would talk to us into the small hours, making good points but repeating himself, as drunk people do. I would understand what he was saying the first time, but we couldn't fall asleep. If we were close to dropping off, he would cut his eye at us and bang the doors. This again was mostly for effect to get our attention. He was a man of few words, but when he did offer advice, it was very telling, and as the months and years went by, I realised just how correct he was. Dad slaved away, bringing us up on a shoestring, and he stayed the course for us. Now, after Ina left, the circumstances were naturally affected for the worse. Chris and his siblings' behaviour became increasingly delinquent, and he said, Chris, I vividly recall one council flat we lived in during 1975 in the middle of Haggerston slums. We had no eating and no furniture, not a stick. Father somehow managed to salvage enough money from his measly wages to ensure there were always eggs and bread on top of the fridge, even if there was a little else inside of it. He would give us 50p each to get some fish and chips, as he was often on shifts and couldn't cook for us. Most of the time we ate egg sandwiches. People talk about hardship. My father had to bring up 4 boisterous kids on that £90 a week wage. He was dutiful, which is one of the traits of a good man. He provided as best he could for the family. The relationships Chris had with his 3 brothers had proved to be of pivotal importance in his life. The central issue that has always been a constant feature of Chris's life is acceptance. He always says that he wanted to seek acceptance in so many ways from so many people. He said, this is something that has been ever present for me, and I've thought about it at great length. They say that many people spend their adult lives trying to work out their childhood. Well, I have mine worked out. I know why acceptance is such a force for me. It is because of the way I was treated as a child by my brothers, David, Simon and Peter. Chris was the youngest. Although there were only 4 years between all of them, he was always keen to be around them. He always wanted to go where they were going. He desperately wanted to get into trouble like they did, smoke the same cigarettes, steal the same sweets. He wanted to be accepted by them and be with them. However, this was never the case. They'd constantly look down on him. He said, they used to call me a cunt. One of them didn't even talk to me. He said I was too ugly to be his brother. I was always belittled by my older brothers. It was the most inequitable of relationships because I adored them. When Chris was in his early teens, he would sometimes suggest that they might have done certain things differently. They would scoff and they'd say things like, shut up, you're silly, you're only a fool. and they were always telling him how to do things, that what he was planning was wrong, or how he had reacted to a circumstance was stupid. He used to fight all the time with David, but he only won once during all those years. One particular day, he had cornered Chris and was hitting his arm very hard when he suddenly turned back and smacked him one. He bloodied David's nose, so David went and told his father, who chastised Chris. Every other fight with David, well, Chris lost. Sometimes, Chris said, the television set would get broken because we used to fight over which channel was showing. His brother Peter never used to hit him. He just dismissed him verbally, which was actually, for Chris, more damaging in the long run. Simon was a very hard puncher, Chris said, which he found out when he knocked him flat in a playground in Peckham when he was only 12. So, he kept out of the way and only had a couple of fights with him. Chris started to realise that nothing he said would ever get through to them. Even so, he still wanted their acceptance because he loved them. They were his brothers. That became a key issue in his life as he grew up to be a man. In many ways, it was a very positive force because he had to prove himself to the world. That's what he felt, specifically in regards to the business of boxing. However, in the back of his mind, Chris said his blossoming career as a pugilist became a way of proving himself specifically to them also. Funnily, after he made champion, David actually said to him, "You should be grateful for all those beatings we gave you. It has made you the world champ." David said he owed him. That is the way his brothers were, and that is what he had to put up with growing up. They were really harsh on him, but actually what Chris realised was that they were also harsh on themselves. Later, as an adult, he still loved them, but no longer needed their acceptance. However, this background, of course, has obviously had a deep effect on Chris. He finds himself, even today, looking for acceptance as an adult, even though professionally he was world champion, and personally he contributes the kind teachings and examples and wants to help people. However, the omnipresent desire to be accepted was deeply ingrained in Chris from his childhood and would indelibly colour the course of both his life and his career in the ring. His primary education was at Northwold Infant School in Stoke Newington. Other children didn't play with him. He was told this was because he was too rough, but Chris didn't have a problem with that. He was never a kid who played with toys and games, not least because they couldn't afford any. He never liked that. He was more into stealing crisps and sweets. He was sometimes bullied because of his broad nose. They used to call him Hoover and Shotgun Nose, and it used to bother him, and he would wish for a slimmer nose. But now, as an adult, as a man, he says he likes it. He says it's a beautiful African nose, and the only one I have. It also works very well. He said his feet are like dragon's claws, but they are the only two I have. I have a gap in my teeth, but that is just me. As for my nose, it is actually a superb shape. It has made me a great deal of money. Why? Because when you hit my nose, it simply goes flat rather than breaking. When they moved to South London when he was 11 and went to Bellenden Junior School before moving on to Thomas Carlton Secondary. Unfortunately, by this point, he had a somewhat boisterous reputation, Chris, and was suspended 18 times in one school year for misbehaviour. He used to get into fights all the time over marbles, and if it wasn't marbles, it was protecting smaller kids from the bullies. As a kid, he loved movies, like The Three Musketeers, and he still loves watching films today. Back then, he just wanted to be like the characters he saw on the big screen. Chris would look at these characters and he would take inspiration from them. So, in his head, when he was going to grow up, he was going to be one of these guys off the film screen, swinging into battle from a chandelier and taking on and beating anybody while still being utterly chivalrous and stylish. He modelled himself on characters like that, and that's one of the reasons he got suspended from school so many times, going to the aid of bullied kids. Chris said he was a loner and he drew little influence from his peer group, instead looking towards those sort of movies for his inspiration. Occasionally, however, it was Chris's short fuse that caused the problem. The problem is, when you don't know how to express yourself, your feelings then manifest in a fashion that is potentially immature and angry. And he said, one time, I said to this kid, "You're chewing your gum too loud." And that was that. Bang. I dropped him. My build was only average, but I was always extra. Namely, I was a showman. I have never been a show-off. That is a negative word. My intention was, and still is, to be a showman and to entertain. He said he wasn't powerful, so he lost as many fights as he actually won, but he was righteous. He fought at least 3 days a week with bullies, and at least 4 days a week with his brothers. He then moved to Peckham Manor Secondary School, where such behaviour continued, and he was expelled after only 1 month. When he was 13, he grew dreadlocks and became, in his words, a rasta. He smoked a lot of weed, he said, as well. He eventually cut the locks off because his father stopped talking to him. His father was Jamaican, and he wasn't into the rasta lifestyle, so he was very disapproving. However, he did love Bob Marley. The album Exodus was on his dad's record player all the time. Chris said, I think at one point it was the only record he actually had. Now, despite being on constant rotation, Chris was never tired of hearing the album. For him, it was his homely feel cut into that vinyl. And still today, whenever he hears that record, it brings back floods of memories. Back then, Chris had so much energy. However, he didn't always do the correct thing. He still had a lot to learn. That energy carried over into his behaviour outside of school as well. If someone wanted to steal some sweets, Chris was always the first in the queue. And he didn't just take a single Mars bar. He would grab 5. He would take the task in hand, and he would do it. One day, his father came back from work and he said to my brothers, "Where's Christopher?" No one knew. At 9 o'clock that evening, there was a knock at the door, and it was the police who informed Chris's father that he'd been taken into care. Chris said he doesn't know if the authorities can do that without consent, but they certainly did it with him. They had a social worker assigned to Chris for some time at Peckham Manor. He was called Mr. Lord O'Keene, an African fella who drove this little white Datsun. Chris said, I didn't even know what a social worker was. I just didn't understand. Peter was the first brother to actually be taken into care from the family, and then David, and then Chris. Simon stayed at home. It wasn't the father's fault. Irving didn't give them up into care. The children was taken from him. It wasn't a complete shame for Chris because it had become boring at home, he said, with his dad. He couldn't stop misbehaving. It was in Chris's nature, and he says, I remember thinking, why is this man beating me so much? I realised it was because I was getting caught. So, Chris said, I stopped getting caught. The first care home Chris went to was the Hollies in Sidcup. It was a massive complex made up of 36 different homes, each named after trees, and one called Reception Centre, which is where Chris was. His brother David was in Larch. He was met at Reception Centre by a member of staff who took him on a tour of the building. He showed him a room which had a table, tennis table, a pool table, and a communal eating area. The tour continued, revealing a tuck shop, a storage room, and the staff room, before finally ending up at Chris's dormitory. Then they sat him down and they gave him his briefing. Chris said, being taken into care was almost like winning the lottery. Can you imagine my sense of bliss? The fridge was full of food, beef burgers, sausages, everything. I could play pool. I had a dorm with new friends to meet, and most fantastically of all, my own warm bed. No more 4-to a mattress. The whole place was even heated. For Chris, it was such a wonderful experience meeting those kids from Scotland and Manchester and all over the UK, seeing their different attitudes, hearing their different tales. The first term at the Hollies was one of the best experiences of Chris's life. He had 3 meals a day, table tennis, pool, and there were girls. For Chris, that was heaven. He said, we used to climb down the drain pipes to get into their dorms. It was such good fun. But, just as at school, he found himself getting into trouble and was shifted between care homes several times in 4 years. In 1979, he went to Yastrid Hall in North Wales, which he now knows to have been in the midst of actually a sexual abuse scandal that did not come to light until the mid-90s. When it was revealed that a network of adults appeared to have been involved in abusing children across the country. Chris says he wasn't sexually abused or otherwise. He didn't even know that there was a problem. It transpired that certain children were being abused, but at the time, just Chris never knew about it. He said, admittedly, I was engrossed in my own little world, but fortunately for me, the whole terrible saga passed me by. From Yastrid Hall, he went to Stanford House in Shepherd's Bush for 7 weeks. in a lockup for assessment. From there, he was sent to St Vincent's in Dartford for a month before being expelled and taken to Orchard Lodge in Crystal Palace for another 7-week assessment in a secure unit. From there, he went to Carib, a care home for ethnic minorities in Nunhead. Again, he was expelled after only 1 month and then sent to Davy Street in Peckham. All this time, Chris was just an unruly boy. He had that short fuse. He was also a very fast runner, quite clever, and his sleight of hand wasn't too bad either. He took full advantage of his skills, always breaking into staff rooms and tuck shops or the newsagents down the road to bill for cartons of cigarettes. Such petty crimes later progressed to shoplifting and repetitive absconding. I think you could describe Chris's childhood as a difficult one. But Chris sees things in a completely different way, and he said in his autobiography, "My view is this. Moving around so much is the perfect way to ensure that an individual continues to have new experiences. You never get stuck in a rut when you're barely at the same place for more than 3 months at a time. Constantly having to make new friends was not a burden because I preferred my own company anyway. I was still something of a loner. Now, as an adult, I could travel anywhere and feel comfortable in any situation. An ability I put down partly to these teenage years spent on the move." Now, it was around this time that, despite Chris's antics to the contrary, he started to read Proverbs, although it would be some years before he succeeded in applying himself to many of the words he was actually reading. The wisdom they offered, well, it always appealed to Chris. He was always enthralled and intrigued by the wise man and the words. Now, in North Wales, there was a kid in care with him called Timmy Bryan, who had this marvellous way of strutting about. Chris watched him swagger around and noted the effect that this actually had on people. So, Chris started to do his own version, with his own spin on things. Timmy, he said, was a very courageous black kid from Nottingham who thought of himself as Superman. He used to point his hands skywards like he was flying through the air, and Chris used to enjoy watching this. Sometimes, Chris said, I still copy him. Now, if you've watched Chris on television, perhaps maybe on things like A Question of Sport or anything on social media, you've probably seen Chris doing this. You know, when a show starts, the warm-up man asks the audience to give a round of applause, even though no one has done anything of note yet. Chris always thought that was an odd situation, so when it happens and the applause starts out of nowhere, Chris often puts his hand in the air like Superman, like Timmy Bryan. For Chris, it was just a fun thing to do, but of course, critics look back on it and say, oh, look at Eubank, assuming that they're clapping him. Chris said, I'm not actually assuming that. I'm just being a big kid again, back in North Wales with Timmy. At the last care home, Davy Street in Peckham, Chris was getting into trouble, like he was in all the other care homes, with one particular care worker in this instance. He was a huge man, very tall. It was not his considerable size that was most threatening to Chris. What was most scary was the fact that he never treated Chris for what he was, namely still a teenager. He saw Chris from day one as an adult, and for that reason, his obvious dislike for Chris felt much more tangible and intimidating. Chris said, one day, we'd had yet another disagreement over something I had done, so he cornered me. He was really angry and breathing heavily with fury. He leaned down over me and said in a truly menacing tone, I don't give a fuck about any of this. I will kill you. Now Chris stood up to his fair share of bullies and bigger men during his younger years, but Chris knew this man was simply too big and too aggressive to mess around with. After this unseemly confrontation, Chris went to the bathroom, and because the home was a lock-up at the front, he crawled out of the window and was gone. He was never in care again. Now, because of Chris's antics in all the care homes, the issues that he was facing at the time, and because he was just being so unruly, when he decided to visit his father when he was on leave from the care homes, the father, Irving, couldn't tolerate Chris's behaviour, and he refused to have Chris back at the house at all. So, after leaving the care home, for the next 18 months, Chris Eubank was homeless. He was a teenage kid, shoplifting daily and earning easily over £100 by 6 o'clock each night. He said I was young, quick, and had good sight of hand and bundles of courage, so I was never really too compromised. I had girlfriends all over the place, and as much marijuana, special brew and treats as I wanted. I went to blues dances, called showbins 2 or 3 nights a week, and was driven around everywhere by taxi wearing the finest clothes. I was my own boss. I had no parents to report back to, no school to trouble me. I was the lord of my own manor. During this time, Chris actually became part of one of the most proficient shoplifting gangs in the country. He said on a bad day we would take home £110 per man, but when we were on song, we would make it £180 each per day. At the time, the average wage in the UK was perhaps £60 a week. There were 4 of us in this gang, Chris said. Myself, Huey, Sticks, Nasty and Beaver. Sticks took his nickname from the Jamaican term for a thief, while Nasty earned his moniker because he was girl mad. They were both Nigerians. Beaver was the last man to join up. Chris looks back on it and he says, I now realise that this behaviour was foolish, but having gone through it myself, I can relate to youngsters and talk to them effectively about getting caught up in this kind of lifestyle. Chris outlined what it was like to be a part of this gang and how things were operating at the time. He said, we worked Monday to Friday, consummately professional, and we were very exacting in our standards. We wore suits, shirts and ties, and always looked immaculate. Before a job, I would put on my Italian mohair suit, a crisp shirt and a tie, and my prized Burberry coat. At the time, Burberry had just introduced these extremely sturdy security tags, so stealing one of their range, well, it wasn't an option. You had to buy your Burberry coat. Chris said, I vividly remember going to Haymarket to purchase mine. It cost £180 and was a sight to behold. Magnificent. Oh man, I felt I'd arrived. On the streets, how you dress is inextricably linked to how much respect you command. So I was always intimately fascinated by the latest fashions. That may well have had something to do with my latter-day passion for dress code, he said. Well, that year on the streets for Chris was just exciting. It was a thrill. His gang were at the peak of their shoplifting prowess. They had all this money and freedom, and they just never wanted to compromise that by staying at a hostel. Instead, Chris would crash on friends' floors most of the time, flitting from one rundown flat to the next. He blagged it, as they say. He would go to someone's house and get so drunk that he couldn't leave. It was during this time that Chris started to smoke weed very heavily. He began when he was only 12, but by this time on the streets, he was a very heavy user. A lot of his shoplifting money was spent on weed, booze and clothes. He said he must have smoked thousands of pounds of ganja over the years. He still knew quite a few Rastafarians, and that influenced his attitude towards smoking as well. About once a week, he would not be able to get a floor for the night, so he would break into a car and sleep on the back seat. He said that he spent many happy nights napping on car seats in Peckham, Camberwell, or the Elephant and Castle. On a few occasions, he did end up sleeping under a mattress, but he didn't like it. It was cold. He still got through to his bones. The longest stint he had under a proper roof was at Nasty's. Even then, he got tired of this after a couple of weeks and said, Look, Chris, I can't handle this anymore. You need to find somewhere else. When you think about it, Chris was only a kid still at this point, but he'd been living on his own and his own instincts for such a long time. His sense of self-survival was deeply ingrained. When your mother isn't around and you live with your father who's doing long shift work, you don't really have time to be a child. If you want food, you have to find it yourself. And with the benefit of hindsight, it's apparent that Chris's personality was becoming heavily predisposed towards the life of solitude, hardship and suffering that is boxing. Chris maintains to this day that his childhood never felt like this. He said, I have no complaints, but looking back, I do accept that in a sense I was training for the noble art from almost my first breath. Of course, however buoyant he kept his disposition, life in the street wasn't all a bed of roses. Inevitably, he found himself in compromising situations from time to time. He told a story. He said, one night, I had nowhere to sleep, so Sticks introduced me to a chef he knew vaguely. I later found out he was also gay, but no one told me this at first. I needed a roof for the night, so I had to keep calm when I went inside his dishevelled flat and saw dozens of machetes and knives all over the house. I said to myself, I'll be okay to sleep on the settee. But he was adamant, saying it's a matter of principle that you sleep on the bed. So Chris politely refused, but he was insistent. He seemed cool to Chris, so he eventually said, "Fine, okay," and settled down in his bed. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he suddenly felt this big hand wrap around his waist and start to pull him backwards as he cuddled up to him. Chris was out of bed like a flash. Then it struck him that he was with a complete stranger whose house was filled with cutlasses and various other blades, and now he may have offended this man's feelings. The night before, he had burgled a house in Seven Sisters Road and took a camera which he'd left on this man's coffee table. I tried to say to him calmly, "I'm not like that," before grabbing his camera and clothes and hot-footing it out of the door. He headed out into the street, but as he was halfway down the road, he got this bad feeling and decided to hide behind a wall for no specific reason. Seconds later, a police patrol car slowly drove past. Chris was always blessed with an intuitive street sense that kept him out of trouble so often. Well, imagine if they would have found him, a young black teenager wandering the streets in the middle of the night, out of breath and with a camera around his neck. Chris also spoke about another night where he took a taxi to a gentleman's outfitters in Brighton. Now, they usually hired a taxi to take them around to the daily targets with a gang. The driver would be paid 70 quid for the day, and he was aware of what they were doing, but the driver happily took the 70 quid. When they got there, the driver pulled up into a side street, and they got out with the tools, namely a pickaxe, and it was 3 a.m, and the streets were deserted. The store had a double set of floor-to-ceiling glass doors. They were alarmed, but that was never a deterrent. So Chris took the pickaxe and embedded it into the top right-hand corner. Then smash again, in each corner 4 very deliberate and targeted blows so that the large pane was weakened. It was then simple enough to kick the glass through and walk into the store. Of course, the alarm was going off, which in the still of the night always sounded amplified 1,000 times. However, Chris was serenely calm. All the butterflies he'd had before the event had dissipated, and this was how he was with any job, he said. Whether it was stealing clothes or fighting a contender started, he would be at peace. So as soon as he got inside the store, he grabbed about 6 suits and then just stood there, stock still in the centre of the store, soaking up the peace. When he was ready, he simply walked to the taxi and headed back to London. For him, that was easy. On the M23, however, there was 2 sleek police Jaguar cars pulled up alongside them. He looked behind, and another one had taken position to the rear. It transpired that somebody had heard the alarm, saw Chris break in, and called the police. That was it. He was nicked. There was no escape. They hauled him up in court, and he explained that it was just a matter of money, that this just wasn't his usual behaviour, but we know differently. Things were looking quite bleak, but thankfully for Chris, the judge granted him bail, which Chris then jumped and decided at this point of his life that London and England was just no longer the place for him to be. So he decided to venture for a new life, which was waiting for him in New York City. So, remember earlier on in the story, me talking about Ina moving away from the family? Well, New York obviously was the destination. So for Chris, it was his mother who ultimately plucked him out of that life of delinquency that he was facing at the time. She was actually hearing all the stories from his dad Irving about the misbehaviour. So she asked him to send Chris to New York, and she even forwarded the money for the plane fare. Chris's flight was on the 29th of November 1982. Chris being Chris, he flew in a silk suit with burgundy Italian shoes. But halfway across the Atlantic, he realised this probably wasn't a clever choice of garment. He arrived at JFK after 7 hours in a crammed seat with his silk suit looking like one big crease. He did a lot of thinking on the plane, and he promised himself he would stop smoking, he would go to church, and he would try to start behaving himself. He also thought it would be a good idea to go to a boxing gym, mainly just to get fit. He knew that his peer group in London would make it very hard for him to forge a new life, so he was fully aware that this was the chance of a fresh start. He collected his bags from the airport carousel and caught a taxi with his father to where his mother lived at 161st Street on Melrose Avenue in the South Bronx. Being from the street, Chris didn't feel intimidated with settling into a new environment. One of the first impressions of New York was the culture. He didn't understand how inconsiderate people were with the language and the disrespect that they threw around. It actually took him some time to soak into the new terrain. This was, after all, nothing like even the toughest parts of London was. Chris's acute sense of observation was to quickly prove invaluable. He realised 3 basic facts that would remain constant during his time in New York. Firstly, it was very, very cold in the winter. Secondly, it was bakingly hot in the summer. And thirdly, he was just as poor in New York as he was in South London. In New York, it doesn't matter what colour you are. If you're poor, you're made to feel like an outcast. You can be white, black, Hispanic, Chinese, whatever. If you don't have any money, you just don't get any respect. It was really, really hard for Chris. He often had $1 for his dinner, and that would get him probably about 8 rotten bananas and a quart of milk. He'd put that in a blender with a little nutmeg, and that was basically all he had to eat. Some days his mother would cook for him, so he'd eat decently, but she wasn't always with him, as she worked as a living nurse for an old Jewish lady named Dorothy. So Chris started straight away on the new, less deviant plan of life in New York. He said that he didn't really stop all his vices overnight, but the intention was to go back into a great life, a good life, a clean life. He would eventually drift back in and out of shoplifting later on, but he travelled intermittently between New York and the UK, so some of his old habits, well, yeah, they died hard. But at this moment in time, he was determined to start a clean slate. There was no one to tempt him like in London. He had his friends, and he knew what he had to do while he was here in New York. He had one more chance, and he wanted to be a success, and that meant not stealing, not drinking, and not fighting. He said in the past, before he flew to New York, that he drank very heavily. For him, his choice was either Bacardi or Special Brew, often swilling several cans before he went out in the morning. Now, within 3 months of being in New York, he'd stopped smoking. And it's no mean feat considering the quantity of nicotine and ganja that he was getting through in London. 2 devastating incidents happened, which made him stop smoking cigarettes and joints completely. Now, the first episode was after he had come from Manhattan and stopped off near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx to go into a bar that was near where he lived. There were some guys whom he knew vaguely from playing pool with, and one of them offered him some weed. Now, this was just no ordinary weed, like the weed he was used to in England. This actually knocked him for 6. He walked the 8 blocks home, but before he went upstairs, he trudged into the store on the ground floor. Now, this store was one of these bespoke stores that had just different fascinating objects in, and they used to stock everything from a pin to an elephant, he said. It certainly looked like all the old boxes crammed to bursting piled high, teetering with the weight of these weird objects inside them all. Now, this store was actually run by 2 middle-aged, real African-American New Yorkers from down south, Mr. Seymour and his sister, Norval. Now, this particular day, Norval was serving, and as Chris asked her for whatever it was that he wanted, she looked up at him. Now, when you smoke weed, your eyelids kind of shine and droop. And Chris said, I don't know if she knew what I'd been up to or not, but my perception told me that she did. I could almost read her disappointed eyes saying, and I thought you were a good boy. Now, that look, which he received, withered him on the spot. He said his spirit was crushed. Now, he's always had this deep felt respect for his elders, so that lady's inner dismay, it really hurt Chris, and that was the moment he stopped smoking weed. He gradually then started to cut back on the drink and started to get his life in order. Although he'd been a persistent offender in London, he was still streetwise enough not to steal one thing during his time in the Bronx. Over in America, if they catch you stealing even the tiniest thing, well, they give you a bit of a good hiding before they call the police. New York and certain parts of it, well, even now, still a rough place. And he was there during the early 80s, which it was even more difficult to live in. It had one of the highest crime rates in any city of the world. This really wasn't the place to be taking liberties with people's livelihoods. So Chris started attending church, and he enrolled at Morris High School in the South Bronx, where he studied from 1983 to 1986. He decided to take North American history, Spanish and geography. He didn't have the same temptations around him as he did in London, so he actually became a good student, and he worked hard towards graduation. His transition was well underway. By the time he was in New York, if he had learnt one thing from his teenage years, it was probably this, that almost everybody lets you down. His initial impetus to enter a boxing gym was to get fit. However, he soon realised that with pugilism, he knew the parameters. No one could let him down. It was all to do with him. The only person who could let himself down was himself. So he couldn't help being drawn to that, being drawn to the isolated role and the seclusion of it and relying upon yourself. There was basically just no false promises anymore. It was all on you. His brothers had previously started boxing. Peter went on to beat Barry McGuigan in the Irishman's fourth professional bout. McGuigan, as a side note, went on to win the return match. So Chris was already aware of the sport before he'd even travelled to New York. He'd actually been in the ring before, in the gym where his brothers used to train. However, these few fights were just tear-ups, kids scrapping. In one particular brawl with a kid called Matthew, Chris said he got badly smashed up. All his teeth were chipped and he was heavily bruised. And that early exposure to the business for Chris was very negative. It was an experience which at the time totally put him off the sport. But in New York, he was keen to get in shape, so he started going to the Jerome Boxing Club in Westchester Avenue in the South Bronx. Chris described it as a derelict building, so the gym fees were only $15 a month. However, this was just money he didn't have at the time. Fortunately for Chris, they let him be the caretaker for the gym, which basically meant Chris swept the floors, put the buckets down to catch the rain that came through the roof, and had the keys to the place, so he was always in there 7 days a week. Now, within 3 months of arriving in New York, he got himself into good physical condition, and he was evolving into a very determined character. After 4 months, he was asked if he wanted to spar. By now, he was very motivated, so they put him in with a young man named Horse, a strong Puerto Rican. He got in there, and throughout the first round, Horse hit Chris relentlessly, and the second round was the same. Chris could barely catch his breath, but in the third round, something important happened. Chris hit back. His competitive spirit in the ring had been awakened, and from then on, there was just no stopping him. The gym itself was actually owned by an individual named Adonis Torres. Now, in Chris's words, Adonis Torres was the first person who actually treated him with respect like a man. He was effectively Chris's first manager and really looked out for him in the early days. It was obviously going to be quite daunting in a Bronx gym at that age, and also being a foreign interloper with what was perceived as a peculiar way of speaking. And they used to say to Chris, "This guy's weird. He sounds like an English gentleman." Even though he came from Southeast London, Chris had been teaching himself better speech patterns, accents, and articulation for some time. How he did that, he said, was by listening to the newsreaders on BBC One and the World Service Radio as well. He copied them over and over until it gradually just became the way he spoke. He also learned by listening how the Americans spoke English incorrectly. So at first, Chris was the new boy. However, gradually he became a more permanent fixture in the gym. He was there every day, and over the next 3.5 years, he watched fighters come and go. All the fly-by-nights, the triers, the posers, the good-looking guys with no heart. He seen all of them. He was there throughout. One of the questions that Chris always gets asked about this time of his life was, during the time, was he ever spotted as a prospective champion by others? And he said, the answer's no. I never even believed I was a good fighter myself. I started to be drawn towards learning the art of boxing itself. He said, I began to adore watching other fighters sparring. I love to see them throw a left hook and take a body shot, go through their moves. The art is a beautiful thing once you can do it. I learned so much by watching other fighters. I don't mean just in the ring either. How their personal lives impacted on their careers always compelled me. Really good fighters who were supposed to be going places would get caught up in complicated personal situations, and before you knew it, their aspirations were in tatters. One of the biggest things in boxing is sparring. And sparring was the gospel of New York gyms at the time. It was their faith that everybody spars. Sparring is how you actually become a good fighter. And I think it's far more important than the actual road work, the bag work, the skipping, the shadow boxing, all of it. And the most essential thing you need to do if you want to be a good fighter is probably spar 4 or 5 times a week without fail. And for Chris in New York, sparring was not going through the motions either. These were merciless bang-ups. This was a boxing commandment that he took with him when he returned to England, and to which he adhered throughout his boxing career. So, he started off with one set of 3 rounds, then over the months that progressed into 6-rounders, then eventually full-blooded 12-rounders. He said, we even did some 15-rounders to condition ourselves so that a 12-round fight felt easier. And that's how Chris honed his ring intelligence. There is a ring fitness and there is a road fitness. And if you don't have that ring fitness, well, you may as well not even step into the arena. Chris started to notice one fighter in particular who actually inspired him. His name was Dennis Cruz, a southpaw. He had this seductively poetic way of moving, slipping, bobbing and weaving. For Chris, this was a delight to watch. The jabs were like pieces of art. There was a sign in the gym that read, "The right hand will take you around the block. The jab can take you around the world." Chris became obsessed with being able to box as well as Dennis. He wanted to be able to weave like he did, to throw shots, to retreat, dance around like Dennis did. He wanted to be as smooth as he was in the ring. For Chris, this man was poetry in motion. Over the years, Chris has been asked many times about which boxers actually influenced him, and he always said, Dennis Cruz. He said everyone has flavour, everyone has a perception of how something should be done. Some people have it much deeper than others. Dennis epitomised it for me. The first trainer that Chris had was an older man called Andy Martinez, a Puerto Rican. He was only about 5 foot tall, but he got Chris exceptionally fit. Martinez only initially taught Chris 2 punches, which were the straight left and the straight right. No hooks to the body, no body shots. He only worked with amateurs, mainly getting them in shape, which he actually did superbly. After about 2 years with him, Chris wanted to work with Maximo Perez, the main trainer at the Jerome Boxing Gym. He was from the Dominican Republic and had trained Dennis Cruz. He was the undisputed top man. Maximo had been a fighter himself, and for Chris, it was only logical that the best trainers are former boxers. You know, they're not enthusiasts or observers. Chris said, you need a brain that knows how it feels to be punched, how to throw punches correctly. The Maximo had all the moves and could teach you everything. So for Chris, he was the definitive trainer that he wanted. Now at the time, he took a great deal of advice and counsel from the gym owner, Adonis. And Chris said to him privately, the time has now come for me to learn more punches and evolve into a better fighter, and I can't do that with Andy. Very diplomatically, Adonis responded by saying, that will be seen as unkind by him because he bought you your first pair of boxing boots. He gives you money for orange juice after training every day. You need to resolve this matter with a great deal of care. So Chris acknowledged the point, and his response was, I appreciate immensely all the things Andy's done. The time he's taken with me. The nights he drove me home or gave me money for food because I didn't have anything. I sincerely appreciate that. But am I supposed to hold myself back because someone has been nice to me? I am trying to make this my way of life. I want to be a good fighter, and to do that, I need a better trainer. I have learned all he could teach me. Of course, Adonis was right in what he was saying, so Chris had to think very carefully about how to speak to Andy with suitable tact. He was very anxious not to hurt Andy's feelings, so he said to him, I don't want to upset you, but it is time for me to move on now. I need to work with another trainer, and if you don't allow me to, then all you're doing is holding me back. That is unfair. I'm sure you don't want to do that. This is not about you, it's about me. I'm not using you. I'm just trying to get ahead. The fact that you've helped so much, I thank you deeply for, but I need to move on. For Chris, he was proud of that moment because he actually stood up and had the courage, as a young fighter, to speak to Andy and tell him about that, because so many other fighters don't tell the trainer anything, even in the gym, so they end up stifling their careers with the wrong trainer. Maximo took Chris on for about a week and then said, You're punching like a girl. I'm tired of telling you the same thing about the left hook. You're slapping the left hook. Go back to Andy. Chris told him he would get it right, so he went into the corner of the gym and stood close by the wall for over an hour and a half, throwing the left hook over and over and over hundreds of times, trying to get the pivot right. He had to get the angle right, over and over, thousands of times in the corner every day, obsessively for weeks. Chris said, "This was a routine of my own making. If I was ever unhappy with a particular punch or move, I would stop, retreat into the corner of the gym, and repeat, thousands of times. By the end of each little punishment session, I would be drenched in sweat. This was intense. I wouldn't just throw the punch, I was trying to perfect every intricate detail." So, although the training with Maximo lasted only 2 weeks, Chris continued to train with him from afar. He'd already been watching him work with his stable of 6 professional fighters from across the gym anyway. He would observe and listen to what he was saying and explain it and then mimic it himself. Even though he didn't have the time to train Chris, he was effectively, because Chris had a very watchful eye, which was the key to success at anything, specifically boxing. In the end, he didn't need Maximo to teach him directly at all. All he needed to do was watch him teach other fighters and duplicate that. So, as the months went by, Chris continued to replicate that without an actual trainer. And ultimately, it would lead to his first amateur fight. In his first amateur fight, the referee actually stopped the contest after only 30 seconds and declared that Chris was the loser. The guy wasn't even the same weight as Chris, perhaps only 10 pounds heavier. But of course that is a big advantage in the ring. And he hit Chris in the chest with a perfect punch, and he was so startled by the weight behind it that it stuttered him back and he froze. He couldn't move, so the referee stopped the fight. He won 8 amateur bouts on the trot after that, all 3-rounders, stoppages or decisions. Chris's amateur career actually consisted of 26 fights, 7 of which he lost, and the remainder he won. Now at this stage, he was incredibly focused, and he was starting to begin to get some momentum. Now, he also talks about a story, aside from boxing, that really stuck with him during his time in New York. And he said, "One day after training, I was in the McDonald's on 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx. I was carrying 2 heavy gym bags and was leaning up against the counter, where a section is hinged for staff to push up and walk out. I was looking out of the window and didn't notice a man who worked there was waiting for me to move so he could get in behind the counter. He tried to lift it, which startled Chris. So Chris turned around to see what was happening, and he stared at Chris and he said, 'Move out of my way, nigger. Move out of the way.' And I said, 'What?' His aggression, of course, took Chris by surprise, so he said, 'What are you going to do?' To which he replied, 'Oh, what, you want some? Right, if that's the way it is, I'll go and get my boys.' So at that point, Chris knew this was a situation that had to be confronted. He pulled his shoulders back, held his head up high, chest proudly puffed out, his arms dropped down by his side, and as they did, the bags that he was carrying dropped down his arms and finally fell off the wrist, leaving Chris standing there in that peacock pose that later became famous. For Chris, that was his natural stance. A porcupine puts his spikes out, a dog growls and shows his teeth. That was Chris Eubank's stance of protection. Chris said, "I never held my hands up with my arms so low and open. The message was very clear. Let's do this. Whatever you've got, I'll have it." Well, Chris said that he thinks someone tipped off the fellow about the fact that Chris was an amateur boxer because he went out the back to get his boys, but they never came back. Now, by the age of 18, Chris was sufficiently skilled to make it through to the light middleweight final of the prestigious Spanish Golden Glove tournament, widely seen as a testing ground for future champions. The semi-final was very tough. For the first time at this point in his career, he sensed the flickering of white lights in his head that would have gone on to become a knockout if he had not eluded further punishment. Fortunately, he went on to get a decision and won the light middleweight belt. The final was just as tough. He was getting punched left, right and centre, and he won because of his aggression. The judges actually appreciated the fact that he was always taking the fight to the opponent. For Chris, this was a landmark victory. It was the first rung on the ladder in his boxing career. We move forward to 1985. Chris is the Spanish Golden Gloves champion. He's briefly for a period of time ranked the best light middleweight in the country on the amateur circuit. So inevitably, the professional ranks come calling. And he'd just gone 19 when he turned professional. At the time, he was actually still at Morris High School, but that decision to turn pro was quite simple for Chris. He needed the money. He was due to earn $250 for his first fight in Atlantic City. And this is what Chris said about that. The day you turn pro is not the day you sign the contract or get your license. It is the day you actually fight. For me, this was the 3rd of October 1985 at the Atlantis Hotel against Timmy Brown. I was absolutely petrified. You were taught to exude confidence in boxing, but that is something which you don't possess at first. You hear about all these great fighters who have 35-0 records, but all you want to do is have yourself respected and win your first fight. Now at the time, Thomas Hearns had this awesome record, and I was just astounded that anyone could be so phenomenal. He was a great champion. You're not thinking of being a champion. You just want the first win and to pocket a few $100s. So, going into Chris's first professional fight, they left him in the room at the Atlantis Hotel by himself beforehand. Probably for about half an hour, he said. But it seemed to him like an eternity. He went through what he described as a searching emotional self-examination. He really put himself through the mill. Are you going to do this? Or are you going to bottle it? That's what he was saying to himself. Are you going to have the courage? Or are you going to be a wimp? Chris's heart was pounding almost out of his chest. He was going into the unknown, something that had always made him uncomfortable. It was a 4-round fight, and he actually won on points. That first purse, as we said, was $250, which was a lot of money, even back then, and even to Chris. But he'd already spent it. He'd been calling a girl in the UK called Carol Siobhan on the school phone and racked up quite a bill. The school authorities actually found out, and Chris had to apologise, explaining that he would pay back every penny. It was a serious enough offence to be expelled from the school, but they gave him the chance to keep his word. So he won that fight and paid the bill. Even when Chris did slip up, he was doing all he could to make amends, which was different from just a couple of years before. This first success in his career would then lead to 4 more 4-rounders, and they were all points victories against Kenny Kaneda, Mike Bagwell, Eric Holland and James Canty, and all of them in Atlantic City. In the summer of 1986, Chris graduated from Morris High, and he'd been a good student as much as he didn't have any friends or even any acquaintances really to distract him. His personality in regards to succeeding in church, school and boxing was very focused, and as a result of that, it alienated people around him because he was a good student. He wasn't getting involved in any of the untoward stuff anymore. He always felt like his schoolmates were just kids in England that he'd been living like an adult himself for years, feeding himself, earning his own money, looking out for himself. So immediately after graduation, he began a course at Sobro College of Technology in South Bronx. And he was on a course for 6 months, learning on a Wang word processor, aspiring to become accomplished with computers. To bring money in, he also had to do various jobs. 1 year before he was to leave New York permanently, his mother introduced him to a man named Alan Sedeka, who owned a building company called Durite. One job that Chris took was on a building site run by Alan's firm. He looked after his office block in Long Island and was paid quite handsomely. His father was in New York at this time and was working on the job with him. And his father used to wind him up all the time. For Chris, it was good to have that family relationship back in tune just a little bit. Another part of the job that Chris had for Alan was to actually make van deliveries, even though he'd never actually driven in his life. And he tells a great story. He says, "One day I was given an automatic, which I tried to think of as just a go-kart. I got in this van and was doing okay until I hit the town and began to feel a growing sense of panic as the congestion built up. I stopped at some traffic lights, but overshot and found myself in the grid where people walk across. So I reversed back the van, but I had no rearview mirror, so I was only looking in the wing mirrors. Crash! There was an almighty bang as I hit a motorcyclist. This angry guy wheeled his motorbike round and parked it in front of my van, so I couldn't move. Look at what you've done to my bike, he snarled. Already, I was thinking about what on earth I could do. I was technically an illegal immigrant without a green card, no driving licence, so we were talking deportation if the police got involved. The guy said, listen, what are you going to do? You hit my bike? So I said, yes, I've got insurance papers and everything in here. Let me just pull around the corner. We're holding up traffic. Everyone is beeping. This is ridiculous. At first, he wouldn't hear any of it. But I persisted, and eventually, after about 5 minutes, he got on his battered bike and began to wheel it out of the way. Then, I just zoomed off into the distance. Who'd have thought it? Chris Eubank, screeching off. So for Chris at this point, he was doing really well. He was doing well at his studies. He had money from jobs and obviously the fights he was winning. But it was keeping him really, really busy. Alan Sedeka was always very keen to see Chris do well. His brother Maurice was also a kind man, Chris said, and one day he actually took Chris to one side and gave him a priceless piece of advice. He told Chris to choose studies or choose boxing. And to use his words, he said, put all your eggs in one basket or risk being mediocre at both. So Chris thought about what he'd said. And he knew deep down, Maurice was right. So Chris made his decision. For Chris, it was a relatively easy choice when it came down to it. One was safe, the other was dangerous. Chris, naturally, would always go for danger. His grain was always to take the riskier, harder route. He always lived in black and white, hot or cold, violence or silence. He said, if you just want to exist, you have to just stay in the grey area. Easy is just existing. I never wanted that. I want to make a difference. Boxing was an extreme but fulfilling life, plus the potential earnings far outstripped any wage as an office worker. For Chris, his mind was made up. Boxing, it was going to be. Shortly after graduation from Morris High School, he started travelling back and forth to the UK. He'd lived in New York at this point for 3.5 years straight, but for the next 18 months he bounced back and forward across the Atlantic. He found that because of a lack of money, he'd sometimes start to get pulled back into the old lifestyle of shoplifting. Chris actually met many people through his relationship with Alan Sedeka, one of whom was Benjamin Aria. Now, Chris describes him as not a nice character. He didn't do anything illegal, but in business he was quite cold. None of the people who worked for him actually liked him, and Chris could see why. The first time he met Benjamin, he actually offered Chris a job as a gopher. Chris, at the time, really needed a job. But he didn't take him up on this particular offer because he was asked about his footwear. Nice shoes, he said. Those are crocodile, right? He shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. Someone bought them for me. Are they crocodile? Now from that second, Chris wasn't interested in him or the job. It wasn't for him. He had played down something that was just a simple compliment. That first impression, for Chris, sealed it. Even though he needed the money, he wanted the right kind of money. The going rate would have been fine, but for Chris it was about respect. Now Benjamin had a brother. Chris described him as a lovely guy named Nathaniel, whom he used to bodyguard for in New York. He would go to casinos or clubs with him and watch his back. It was a bit silly really because he didn't have a gun, and if you go into bodyguard someone in New York, I think you're going to have to carry a firearm. However, Chris's aura was one of psychological dominance. His presence was imposing, so people, he felt, instinctively would back off. He felt he looked dangerous. His eyes was burned with savage focus. Plus, he always dressed impeccably, even back then. He always had his designer clothes from England and his snakeskin shoes. He was probably the city's best-dressed bodyguard. Now, in places like New York, if someone is thinking of attacking, they will first survey the terrain and weigh up the risks. Now, even though Chris didn't carry a gun, his presence was sufficient to nullify any threats because Nathaniel's terrain was perceived as too risky to attack. Chris never thought about being unarmed, and the courage and presence that he displayed meant that no one actually ever did pull a gun, thank God. Now, Nathaniel was landlord of a building in a middle-class area, a really run-down slum of a place near 17th Street and Chelsea, and one day in 1986, Chris went with him to collect some rents that were a little overdue. Now at this stage, of course, Chris is 4-0 as a professional boxer. And one of the tenants that they went to see was a gentleman called Walter Johnson, whom Chris now refers to as Doctor. Nathaniel had brought Chris to the property as this heavy guy. And he said to Chris, "Look, Bede, be very quiet and menacing and just get us paid." Now, Doctor lived in a little studio flat with all his belongings, which he shared with his daughter Callie, whom he'd brought up. Nathaniel left Chris for a while when he went to see someone else, and although Chris had this very hard exterior, Doctor wasn't fazed by it at all. In fact, after a few moments, he quietly said to Chris, "Come back another time, I'd like to talk to you." Nathaniel had introduced Chris as this ultra-hard, up-and-coming boxer. But what Chris didn't know at first was that Doctor was heavily into the martial arts, having studied them since he was 10. He had been coached by his own father and become exemplary at jiu-jitsu and many other forms. That day that Chris met, he relished the opportunity to talk to someone about his passion for such skills, how deeply he had studied and how much he knew about the philosophy behind them. 2 or 3 months go by, and then one day he finds himself in the same area of New York, so he decided to take Doctor up on that offer and drop in for a chat. Even though Doctor was 17 years Chris's senior, the relationship just took off from there. In fact, the older element of the wisdom was part of what fascinated Chris. Doctor would come to the gym and just watch and never say anything. Chris had trainers with him, and he always stayed and observed the workout. To Chris, Doctor struck him as someone who had an innate and vastly experienced sense of the street, obviously had this colossal knowledge of martial arts bestowed that upon him, but even the little things made Chris smile and warm to him. For example, one especially code day, as Chris describes it, he asked him if he had a hat, and he pulled off his own, tugged another hat out of the one that he gave to Chris. The reason he was called Doctor, and why he was referenced as Doctor, was actually because of the combination of his knowledge of Eastern medicine plus his philosophy of life and martial arts. And despite the strange first meeting they actually had, Chris describes him as getting on really, really well. When he moved to the UK back in 1988, they actually kept in touch by phone. When he travelled to see the Mike McCallum, Steve Collins fight in Boston and stayed at the Plaza Hotel in New York, he actually met up with Doctor and immediately continued where they'd left off, reviewing martial arts techniques, ideas, diet and strategy. Eventually, Doctor would join Chris in the UK and would remain consistent friends. To Chris, he'd known Doctor longer than anybody in the country, longer even than his wife. For Chris, he was going to be an invaluable presence during training and in his corner at many of his future professional fights. Initially, they weren't exactly friends, though it was more accurate to say that he was actually teaching Chris the martial arts. That was the common ground that they had. As Chris was mastering the art of pugilism, the noble art, he wanted to own it to near perfection, so actually to incorporate the martial arts for Chris was a necessary evolution of his learning curve. As he mentioned, Doctor had an expansive knowledge of internal and external martial art forms, such as Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu, Karate, Tai Chi, and Chinese boxing, and at first it was very difficult for Chris to incorporate that into his style. He found it very frustrating. He gave an example. He said, martial arts like Pakwa are open-handed, but obviously boxing uses a closed fist. Doctor's martial arts were about holding, striking with your palm and fingers, whereas boxing was about striking only with your knuckles. He was trying to teach me these forms, but because I liked him so much, I couldn't tell him that I was struggling to incorporate them into my boxing. This perhaps went on for about 3 years, Chris said. But what Chris did extract from everything that he observed about martial arts was the foot movement, which was all about positioning and escape. The stance and poise in martial arts is 98% on your back foot and 2% on your front. Boxing is 50-50. Unless you go into a position to strike, at which point you have to vary the weight distribution. So Chris took that and spliced it into his boxing style. People often ask Chris how the martial arts and boxing actually mix. And Chris said this: boxing is actually the highest form of martial arts because you have to learn how to absorb punishment before you can initiate it. Now, another aspect that Doctor brought to Chris's game was stretching. Obviously, as a boxer, flexibility is vital, but many fighters only have flexibility in one dimension, namely that of the direction of the punch. So another aspect that Chris took from martial arts was to develop an all-encompassing flexibility or amplitude. And what he means is the agility in every direction. For example, Chris learned how to do the Japanese splits, which is where your legs are completely flat and then you roll your abdomen and chest to the floor. Now, this is an excruciating skill to actually develop and can only be achieved by constant repetition. Now, a fight is not just about strength, it's also about flexibility. So these extraordinary skills were taken into the ring, could prove to be very powerful tools for a fighter. A doctor could enhance the stretching that Chris was doing, and did so right the way through his career. Some smaller elements also crept in, such as doing doctor's jiu-jitsu wrist exercises, which were very useful for extra strength. No matter how much you bandage that joint, it can still get damaged, of course it can. Sometimes he even made Chris wring out a dishcloth or play a guitar for extra wrist and finger strength. He never did much weight training in his career, lifting weights. Chris is always of the opinion that lifting weights and boxing just really don't go well together. He feels it tightens you up as a fighter. For boxing, it's about being loose and relaxed. Another factor that Chris studied intensely was the philosophy of fighting, the art of war, psychological dominance. Due to his passion for this aspect of the business, Chris became an exceptional adversary. Of course he did, because he was born with an intellect and the courage to actually apply that intellect. It gave Chris the character to manipulate situations before a fight, dealing with the mental strain and the terrain. We've seen it in many of his press conferences, in many of his interviews. You always often wonder why he is the way he is, and this is behind it. This is the reasons behind it. So, as a reminder, at this point, Chris went from the October 3rd date in 1985 to March of 1987. He'd go 5-0 as a professional, as I mentioned earlier, with decision victories over Tim Brown, Kenny Canedo, Mike Bagwell, Eric Holland and James Canty. So in January 1988, Chris returns to the UK to make his home there. Now he came back principally because he wanted to be with his brothers, whom, despite all the crap he had from them, he still adored them. His first fight back in England was actually on the 15th of February 1988 against Darren Parker in Copthorne, whom he actually stopped in the first round. Then came a fighter by the name of Winston Burnett, who was target practice for Chris, but he would have beaten Chris if he hadn't known what he was doing. The next fight, Chris said, was a mismatch against Michael Justin, who was supposed to have ability. He was hard and he was willing, but he didn't have the ability to deliver shots. He showed lots of heart coming forward and swinging at Chris, but it was a no contest. 2 more middle round stoppages against Greg George and Steve Aquilina, and suddenly Chris was 10-0. Over the next 24 months, he was then to fight 11 times on his long haul towards that coveted title shot. At first, however, it was going to be tough because he had no money and he was living in a tiny bedsit. Perhaps inevitably, he found himself occasionally drawn back into that life of shoplifting that I mentioned earlier. Before he'd left for New York, he'd been in many amazing chases with the police and some of the stories that we told earlier, but perhaps, he says, his finest was a 2-day pursuit in mid-1988. He said it was an absolute classic. So, the story goes that they hired a taxi as usual to take him around the targets, and then the taxi escorted them while they took that stolen gear around all the pubs in the Walworth Road or the Unity Centre in Peckham. Now, that morning, the car arrived. That it was a big burgundy Granada, driven by this fat Turkish man aged about 27. Now, he picked Chris up around 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they set off to collect Beaver. Now, they drove to South London and headed for a large department store. Now, on that particular occasion, he didn't take anything, but Beaver stole a leather jacket. As he walked past Chris, he said, "It's hot," meaning that they were being watched by store security. So they started walking briskly towards the exit. And it seemed at first that they'd actually succeeded in their mission not to draw attention to themselves, but suddenly Beaver flicked his fingers in the air, which was a sign for them to take off. Instinctively they split up. Beaver ran off in one direction and Chris headed for the car park, running up the top floor where the Granada taxi was waiting. Chris said, "It's hot, it's on top, we're being chased, I'll get in the boot." The Turkish driver said, "No, don't do that, just sit in the back seat and act normal." Chris says that he should have gone with his gut instincts, but instead He listened and he sat in the back. So they started to descend the spiral ramp that led to the exit, down and round, all the time, waiting for someone to stop them. They pulled around this final corner just before the ticket barrier, thinking that they were going to escape, when, dismay, they saw two policemen stopping all the cars and checking the occupants. The taxi driver said, "Just stay where you are, you'll be all right. They won't know it's you." So, of course, they waited anxiously for their turn in line and decided to lie down on the seat. When the policeman stopped the car, he looked in the back at Chris and said, "That's him." "Step out of the car, please, sir," he said to Chris. So Chris got out immediately, started explaining to the senior officer, saying, "Listen, you've got the wrong man. I haven't got anything. Look in my bags." Unfortunately, the security guard from the store confirmed that Chris was one of the culprits. At that point, Chris played an old trick that he'd learned from his brother David, which he always used to great effect. He began to act frantic, severely agitated. "Oh, I've got heart problems, I've got stress problems, this is making me unwell, I'll take you to court." Chris started shouting and ranting at the officer, trying to work his way out of this predicament. After about 10 minutes, he just started to think he was getting somewhere, when the officer, in a truly disparaging tone, said, "Oh, you just shut up." So that was that. They were nicked. Chris sat down in the police rover and he slid his way across the seat. Already his mind was racing. It was Friday and he knew that he'd end up spending the weekend at the station, and it would be Monday morning before he'd see daylight. He had a blues concert to attend on the Saturday night, which is going to be fun for him. Good music, lots of girls drinking and crubbing, which is close dancing for anybody that doesn't know. He didn't want to miss that. But more worryingly, he knew that as soon as they put his name in the central computer, it's going to alert them to the fact that he had jumped bail from the gentleman's outfitter theft, which he'd been caught on the M23. Then, of course, what's going to happen next is going to be prison, and who knows what the future then would lie for Chris. So this was a desperate predicament. In Chris's head, the only option he had was to escape. The obvious thought for Chris was to jump out of the car at high speed if necessary. Now, as they slowed down to drive around a flyover, he tugged on the door latch, but the child lock was on. So now he's really in trouble. A change of tack was needed. He started to apologise to the police officer in the car. He said, "Officer, sorry about my behaviour earlier. I was out of order." He continued being Mr. Polite all the way back to the station, in full charm mode. They were very much more relaxed by the time the car pulled up. Of course, don't forget, at this point in his life, in his career, he's an unbeaten professional boxer, and he's training almost every day. So he's the fittest man on the planet, really, and he could quite easily get away if he really wanted to. Now, the police officer's grip on his arm had slackened just a little bit, so he knew that, and he noticed that there was an opportunity here, so that when he turned away from Chris to unlock the oversized lock on the door to the cells, Chris pulled free. And he was gone, off like a bullet. The only problem was he was wearing his cherished £140 snake skin shoes, which he'd bought from the Panache in Walworth Road. Now, as stylish as they weren't the best suited to sprinting, not least because they were dress shoes with smooth, wafer-thin soles. The officer was, of course, coming after him, so he ran around a car. He stood one side of the car, hands on the roof, staring at Chris. He said, "Now don't be stupid, son." And voice brimming with confidence, he replied, "Let's see who's stupid." And Chris ran off across the yard, away from the officer and security guard. Because of Chris's fitness, within a few seconds, he was 20 yards or so ahead. Thing is, Chris was running 6 miles every morning before he even opened the gym door. So these guys, well, they weren't going to be able to catch up with him, were they? Now, at this point, as he's trying to get away, he actually barged past a middle-aged man who then decided to join the chase for Chris. He was wearing one of those army jumpers with shoulder and elbow patches. By now, though, Chris had built up a good speed and dived through a subway and then dashed up this long flight of stairs to bring him back to street level, deliberately choosing the steps instead of the ramp to make the chase tougher. Chris said, "I can picture to this day the sight of this man, panting desperately for breath, face all reddened and flushed, skidding through the subway and coming to a stop at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up, and I was standing there grinning at the top of the steps. My heart at this point was barely beating above resting rate. This guy chasing me was so exhausted, he was barely conscious." We stood there looking at each other, waiting for the next move. Then I heard another officer shouting, "Don't stop, get him!" I calmly reached down and took off each shoe, held them up in the air triumphantly before turning around and setting off at speed towards a street full of market stalls. As I weaved my way through the stalls, out of danger, at last I could hear just a faint voice shouting, "Thief, stop!" I was so fit, they never stood a chance. Once I was sure I was safe, I caught the train back to my friend's house and slept there for the night. Now Chris was awakened at 7:45 the next morning by a knock on the door, and he heard someone's voice saying, "Is Christopher here?" before being let in. It was the police. No, it was the cozzers. I know the cozzers. This is a generic term for the police, but real cozzers only come from certain police stations. This particular cozzer was like a huge bulldog, 6'4" with a furious scowl. He didn't care very much for Chris because he was wrong. He came into the front room where Chris was sleeping and said, "Christopher, get up now." Chris was half asleep, squinting from his eyelids, saying, What are you talking about?" So Chris got up, stood in front of him wearing only his socks and underpants. His clothes were hanging up in the wardrobe, but he knew he had to delay getting fully dressed because at that point they would cuff him, especially after his escapology the day before. He couldn't believe his bad luck. This chase had been going on for 2 days now. So yet again, Chris surveys the terrain and he notices that the sash window was too near the officer to offer a realistic chance of escape. So he asked him if he could brush his teeth. The officer wasn't stupid. He followed him into the bathroom where they knew there was a window and they watched him brush his teeth. At the time, Chris had acne, so while he was standing there at the mirror, he squeezed a pimple and the pus and a little streak of blood started running down his face. He turned to the disgusted officer and said, "I've got to clean myself up." "Fine," came the reply, so he continued to stand there. "Can I use the toilet now?" Chris asked. "Sure," came the reply, but he still stood there. "Can I have some privacy in here?" "No," replied the officer. "So he stood there and watched me use the toilet," Chris said. Or rather pretend to use the toilet. After a short while, Chris played out the charade, did a fake number 2, used the toilet paper, and so on, and he pulled up his underpants and then came right back into the front room. "Right, officer, I'll get changed now," he said. He was standing there leaning against the door frame and had started talking to another officer and a girl who lived in the house. Alternately, he would talk to them, turn around, and then keep an eye on Chris. Then, for one moment too long, he had his head turned away from Chris. And that was it. That was all the opportunity Chris needed. So like a flash, he was through the sash window, in only his socks and his underpants. Now, the estates round Walworth Road were real rabbit warrens, so it was easy for Chris to lose anybody who would take up chase. However, it was cold and drizzling, so he was absolutely freezing. As he ran into one courtyard, this little kid, about 13, saw him, and he looked surprised to see someone wearing only socks and underpants running around at 8:15 in the morning, in the rain. He went up to this kid's front door and said, "I'm being chased by the police. I need a coat. I'll bring it back." There was absolute sincerity in Chris's eyes. He could see this brain thinking it over while he's standing there shivering, half expecting the causers to come round the corner at any moment. Eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, he timidly said, "I'll just go and ask me dad." Now, as soon as he was out of the hallway, he grabbed the coat off the hook and ran off. Eventually, Chris made his way to Nasty's flat, and after 2 days on the run, he was finally safe. So, going back to Chris's story and away from these moments in his life, we now go back to his boxing career. Now, after that incident with Maximo in New York, he obviously trained himself, Chris. We mentioned that earlier. And then when he started working in the Jack Pook gym in Brighton, his brothers, who were boxing themselves, introduced Chris to a trainer, Ronnie Davis. He had been the Southern Area lightweight champion himself in 1967, so he knew the business. He was constantly in the gym, Chris, but Ronnie actually worked as a site manager for a building company. So he toiled a long day on site and then would come to the gym, back bent double, and he'd work with Chris. Chris used to say to him, "Come in from the cold, stick with me, I'll take you to the top." And of course, Chris did. He said to Chris, "You only need to train 4 days a week." Chris's response was, "You can come in 4 days a week, I will be here 7 days a week." Well, Ronnie wasn't training Chris. He knew how to box. What he actually needed was someone to be his eye outside of the ring, because there are certain things that you can't see yourself. He would come back to Chris's corner and his perception and observation would be so enlightening because he could see things that Chris was too involved to catch. Ronnie was also a brilliant bodyguard. And by that, what Chris means is not personal security, rather a man who actually knew which fighters were dangerous, which ones were underrated or overhyped. Plus, he could actually protect Chris from the litany of problems, situations and liabilities that boxing exposed to him. There would be so many people trying to get to Chris, hangers-on, charlatans and takers, and Ronnie had a faultless radar for that, and he sniffed them out immediately. He always watched Chris's back against things like that. He was, for Chris, a very good companion, and in Chris's words, I'll always love Ronnie Davis. At this point, the public perception was that Ronnie Davis was now Chris's trainer, so as soon as Chris could, it made sense for him to have Ronnie styled to suit the team image. He had his hair cropped very closely and began wearing immaculate suits just like Chris. No more training bottoms. When he went on to win a title, he insisted he bought Ronnie a Jaguar, and it was far more stylish and made for a better show for the whole bravado. This was just all part of the business plan that they had. It was about showmanship. All Chris's team had to be well turned out. It wasn't just Ronnie. Now, at this point, Chris had hooked up with a local promoter by the name of Keith Miles, and he started to help Chris get fights. He worked 2 jobs in Debenhams and the other in Wimpy because the money he was earning from fighting really just simply wasn't enough. However, it was very tiring, and coupled with his obsessive training, he knew it could have detrimental effects on his performances. So Chris voiced his fears to Keith Miles, who then agreed to pay Chris £120 a week as an allowance. And it was at this time that Chris actually first met the lady that would go on to be his future wife, Karen. Her sister Philippa used to go out with his brother Simon, one of the twins. And one day, he said, I glanced into his kitchen and saw Karen and thought, what a beautiful woman. It would be a dream to be with a woman like that. But this, for him, was an impossibility. She was, as is, a gorgeous woman. And to Chris, in his head, what was he? He was nothing. He had no self-esteem other than his belief in his boxing ability. Back then, no one else knew about that either. So at first, to be with her was just an impossible wish for Chris. By coincidence, Karen had actually seen Chris's 7th professional fight against Winston Burnett at Hove Town Hall back in March of 1988, and she'd come to watch with a male friend of hers. She wasn't dating him, but Chris hadn't even spoken to her at this point. He'd seen her in a supermarket since, but he just didn't pluck up the courage at this point to speak to her. Also, he didn't have a car as yet, so he used to walk everywhere. And people began to notice Chris walking around Brighton, strutting even back then. Jack Pook used to train Chris's brothers at the time, and he said that Chris walked as if he owned the United Kingdom. And Chris walked everywhere like that. He was always very, very proud, no matter how difficult his circumstance. One day, he'd walked about 3 miles into Brighton, and as he was going back past his brother's house in Portland Road, he saw Karen talking to Peter. Chris was wearing a nice black cloth coat and went up to them and said, "Hi, Peter," before turning to Karen and saying, "Hi, would you give me a lift, please?" she said. "Well, I am talking," I said. "Well, when you've finished, if you don't mind, would you give me a lift back to my apartment? I'll be in the 7-Eleven buying a Lucasade." In Chris's mind, she just looked stunning. Shortly after, she came and picked me up from the 7-Eleven, he said, in her old black banged-up Fiat, and took me to my apartment in Trafalgar Square. When we pulled up outside, I turned to her and said, "Did you come to my last fight?" To which she said no. So I said, "Would you like to see it on video?" I was delighted when she said okay. She came up to the apartment, but while we were watching the video, she began to have a severe headache and neck spasms. I gave her some painkillers, but the headache just got rapidly worse. By now, I was thinking, okay, I'm a minority in this country, and where I've been living in New York, this kind of thing happens all the time. People get blackmailed or conned. I called an ambulance, and they took her to hospital, where it became apparent that fortunately, she was being genuine. At that point, Ronnie walked in and said, "What have you done? What did you do to her?" To which I vehemently protested my innocence. What actually happened was, unbeknown to her, she'd actually suffered a trapped nerve the previous day during a scuffle at the jewellery shop where she'd worked. One of the owners had accidentally hit her on the back of the neck as she was grappling with a robber. Now, Keith Miles found out about what happened and assumed the worst, so he had to tell him too. Chris said, "I didn't touch the woman. She broke down." They were all very suspicious. The next day he was walking through Brighton's Norfolk Square, past where Karen works, so he went in to see if she was better. She was there. She said she was fine and gave Chris a thank you card. And he said, "Thank you. It was not a problem. Would you like to go out for dinner?" She said, "Yes." And Chris, of course, was elated. And Chris, in his autobiography, of course, would expand more on the relationship with Karen. And he said, "We started to go out, and with my £120 a week allowance, we had some good times. All I did was train, so that money went a long way. We went out quite often. I would train first thing in the morning, about 5:30, finish about 7:30, and then start gym work at 2 p.m. or 4 p.m, depending on how I felt. At this point, I was touched with it. I was on heat to train. It was a passion that I could feel within my solar plexus, an inner passion. At first, the people around me were sceptical that I could keep this focused and have a woman in my life at the same time, but it was never an issue. I know it is for some fighters, but it never even started to become a problem for me. I've always remained my own man. In a sense, because Karen was so easy to get on with, it eliminated the complication of having a difficult girlfriend. I knew this was the woman for me, so I started the relationship off correctly. I hadn't been out with many women seriously up to this point. I had a girlfriend in England before I left for New York, and over a period of 3.5 years, I only had 2 girlfriends over there. I was so focused with my training, and also with the church. The scriptures taught me that you shouldn't fornicate, and I did the best I could. The thought was constantly in my mind, but I took that energy and channeled it into training. Karen and I became very close, very quickly, and moved into a flat together above a garage that Keith Miles owned. Now, bear in mind, I was not famous or wealthy at this point, so to this day, I know Karen is with me, for me, which, for a celebrity, is priceless. Now, Chris's relationship with Keith Miles, at this point, wasn't working as well as maybe what he thought it was going to work. He used to talk Chris down and, he'd treat him like he was an idiot, and he would say, "Do as you're told." Chris is really scathing about this period of time. And he says, I must state that at times he was a very nice and real character, but when he spoke to me in that way, it just wasn't dignified and I couldn't accept that. And I said to him, "When you disrespect me, I'd rather starve than accept your disrespect." So that business relationship ended. And of course, with that went the flat above the garage. So, Chris and Karen moved into Karen's mother's house in early 1989, during which time Karen became pregnant with their first child, Christopher. Now, they had all the belongings in this one little room with a fold-up futon to sit on and a little kitten for a pet. Chris was training very hard at this point, and some of that time was actually spent with a superb boxer known as Harold Graham. That first fight that Karen had watched before they was even dating was the only time in 47 contests that she actually came to see a bout of Chris Eubank's. Chris was of the mind that he'd never wanted his wife, his mother, father or children at a fight. In his mind, boxing matches are a desperate situation and he could never understand how fighters wanted their family present. He said, "I realise some say it motivates them, but I could never understand that. I wouldn't even allow my father to watch. He would have a drink and torn the place down in excitement. When I later had a gym upstairs at my home, my kids occasionally came up to watch me train, but they never saw me sparring." While they'd been trying for the first child, Chris said to Karen, "It is not possible that we will have a girl. It will be a boy, and his name will be Christopher." There was no more than a 0.001% chance of having a girl. That's what Chris felt. Karen, of course, didn't see it that way, but Chris was convinced. He spoke about this in the press when he was starting to attract media attention about his lengthening unbeaten record in a very blunt fashion, and they actually made a big headline of it in the press. But, of course, that's the press, and they usually cook up something that's a bit more exaggerated. Sure enough, though, Christopher actually arrived on the 18th of September 1989. Chris said he felt the same when they had the second child, Sebastian, on 18th of July 1991. By then, he thought it'd be nice to have a girl, and honestly, in his mind, he wanted a girl. And they eventually had Emily, who arrived on the 19th of April 1994, and then they would go on to have Joseph on the 23rd of October 1996. Chris was very proud to be present at all of their births, he said. Something that we touched upon earlier on is what Chris says in his autobiography about the fact that people in the fight business worry about the effect a relationship can actually have on a boxer's heart. And there is a saying which goes, after a personal quarrel between a man and a woman, the former suffers chiefly from the idea of having wounded the other, while the latter suffers from the idea of not having wounded the other enough. Thus, she will endeavour by tears, sobs, and decomposed mien to make the heart heavier. Well, fortunately for Chris, that wasn't the case with Karen. They didn't have a lot of money, and they were trying to get on the straight and narrow. Plus, Chris was constantly training. Karen, as we mentioned earlier, used to work in a jewellery store for two fellas called Kevin Douglas and Bert Wilkins. Now, they were into boxing, and they knew all the old boys in the business like Mickey Duff and Jarvis Astaire. And Kevin and Bert were very kind to Chris. They literally used to feed Chris and take him around to a show and give him a good time. Even then, Chris was aware of what was correct. And he gave an example of this. He said, one day, I was in a car with Kevin and Bert when this man took a parking space that we'd been waiting for. Kevin was known as a hard man, a very streetwise cockney who was into his antiques business. He didn't want to confront this man because of his size. He can't do that. It's a matter of correctness. So I got out and said to the man, move the car. He said, I'll only be a minute. But I firmly said, move the car. Not in a minute. Now. And the gentleman moved the car. Now, Karen and Chris knew that they couldn't stay in that one room at her mother's house forever, so they managed to get a mortgage and buy a small 3-bedroom masonette in Hartington Road for 64,000 quid. During this time, he actually met someone who would become one of his closest friends, a man by the name of John Regan. Now, Ronnie was working for him at the time and kept reporting back about Chris's developing career. John started coming to fights, and gradually, Chris and John became friends. Money was still short, so Chris went looking for a new promoter, and he would travel up to London from Brighton on the train, dodging the fare each time, and visit many promoters to discuss working together. His father, Irving, had warned him about promoters and managers, saying, don't watch the ones who take hundreds or even thousands of pounds, watch the ones who take hundreds of thousands. So Chris was wary of who he wanted to work with. He had sourced the names of all the big promoters. One such man was Frank Warren, who had Chris come up to London every day for 2 weeks and kept him waiting every time. One time in his office, he'd waited ages, Chris, and then went out to get himself an orange juice. When he came back, the secretary said that Warren had left. That this was the type of treatment that Chris had to put up with from some of the promoters, Frank Warren being one of them. It was only a matter of one-upmanship, though, which it failed. Now, at this time, Chris has a 10-0 record, and he's beginning to attract attention from boxing insiders. He was well aware that the fights he wanted would just not present themselves. So, he had to let it known that his eye was on the fight with the then Commonwealth champion, Nigel Benn. Now, Benn was a vicious fighter of huge power, who at that point was undefeated in 20 fights. Moreover, the ferocity and venom of his victories had made him one of boxing's most awesome new talents. Chris, even then, was saying, I can beat him, just give me that fight. But, so far, no one was giving Chris the credit that he deserved. So, his remarks about having this fight with Benn were just laughed off. Part of the problem that the press had with Chris Eubank was his style, because it was very unconventional. He didn't attract the attention in the ring that he wanted to attract. And most boxing insiders and press thought that it would be an easy win for Nigel Benn. And they thought that Chris Eubank's statements about him beating Benn were just too premature to be even taken seriously. There were some out there that even laughed at Chris's lisp and ridiculed him for that. You know, as if that had anything to do with his boxing ability, of course. He didn't. He said, I did see a lady once, Melanie Bloor, who taught me how to pronounce my S's more clearly. After a fight, though, your mind and your body are so ravaged that you often talk very fast and my lisp would become much more pronounced. Throughout my career, my feelings on the matter were like this. If you want to ridicule my lisp, okay, but that's me. You're letting yourself down. Despite all the criticisms, Chris had realised that he did have a lot of flavour, and that is what makes you box office potential. Now, it's fair to say that Chris obviously had only fought 10 times thus far, but he did know his capability, and he said he knew his capability within himself. His 11th fight was against Simon Collins at York Hall, Bethnal Green. Now, this fight was actually taken at 6 days' notice, despite the fact that Chris had had a very tough bout against Anthony Logan the following week. The Jamaican boxer was very hard. He came to fight, to load up, and to punch very hard. Now, Chris said when you're faced with someone who wants to use their strength to beat you, you have to use your skill to beat them. Don't try and match them with your own strength. Even if you are stronger, that is not the way to progress. So he beat Simon Collins on a technical knockout in round 4. He said he was always in control. But what interests Chris about this fight is when he watches it back is the remarks of the commentators. They showed that they had no understanding of Chris as a boxer or as a person at this point. As Chris said before, he broke him down with skill. He used the jab, he moved around, he stayed out of the way, and then moved in and took him out. He did talk a little bit in this fight, and sometimes you can't help yourself, he said, but it was not something that was deliberate. Now, Charlie Magri was commenting for ITV on this fight. He was actually really critical of Chris's performance. You could actually hear the disregard in his voice, but he had to stop himself because he was quietly impressed. However, he made 2 major observations. Firstly, that Chris had his hands down too low and that Nigel Benn would mercilessly take advantage of such an exposed defence. Well, Chris can guarantee that any man who had gone in with Nigel Benn at the time in his prime with the hands up in an orthodox defence would have got knocked out. That stance means you're not ready to fight, you're ready to block. That was using too much of a textbook defence and largely against the consensus of the opinion in the game. Chris knew that you couldn't fight Ben that way, and he believed that you would have to fight him in an unorthodox fashion. Check counter, and everyone would have to be unconventional because Ben was so vicious. Ben fought many opponents who had their hands up in a perfect boxing manual style, and he knocked most of them out. Magri then made his second observation of note when Collins had just been stopped in the 4th. He pointed out that Nigel Benn would have taken Collins out in round 1. Chris's response to that, exactly. Ben would have steamed in there and probably finished it in less than 60 seconds. The point was this. What use is a bout like that for a fighter? If a boxer has no control, that is what happens. Chris preferred to gain more ring experience, work his moves, draw something positive from the match. He wanted to play chess. He needed to entertain the public and enhance his own abilities at the same time. And the only way to do that was to prolong a contest. He would bring the opponent to the brink of being stopped. Then, just as people were craving for the stoppage, he would pull back to the ropes, look at the crowd and gesture. And of course it drove people crazy. But that was Chris, and that was what made box office. A first round win, of course, is very explosive, but all you've really achieved is a missed opportunity for target practice. First round wins are headlines. Chris believes substance is more important. After the fight, he was interviewed on television, and he said, "My trainer said, if you have him on the hook, take him out. This is a nasty business. It's not a game. We are in this as professional businessmen. It's sport to the spectators, but not to the pugilists like myself." This was the most public expression to date of Chris's supposedly controversial views on the profession. Chris was so sure he could beat Nigel Benn by now that he took on a world-class, highly rated fighter in Anthony Logan in his next bout. This was only his 12th professional outing, so he was still classed by many observers as a novice. Logan had actually fought Nigel Benn for the Commonwealth middleweight title and almost knocked him out. Then just as Ben was teetering, he'd thrown a shot from down by his left ankle, a left hook that knocked Logan out. Even though it would be another 13 fights before Chris would finally come face to face with Nigel Benn, he was already aiming at getting that shot. With Logan, he knew if he could win, it would eventually lead him to Benn. Everybody in the boxing fraternity thought Chris was taking the wrong fight at the wrong time, and they were saying to Ronnie, "We're surprised you're putting your boy in." That's how they were talking at the time. Even Ronnie asked Chris, "Are you sure?" To which Chris replied, "Don't even question me." Previous to Logan, the caliber of fighters that Chris had been in with was journeymen, mainly seasoned fighters. But that said, Chris was a novice and they still needed to be beaten. After all, they were professionals as well. When he took on Logan, he stepped up to the big league. It was only an 8-round fight for contention, not a championship bout, but he'd only boxed 8 days before against Simon Collins, so to take the next fight on so swiftly, well, props to Chris Eubank, but he said it never troubled him. Boxing for him was his way of life. He was always fighting. It was a constant feature of his world. And in his eyes, he had to make a name, so he took whatever fight he could get. He had to earn money. Remember, this was a living. The idea was to earn money and win titles. Chris, well, he was relentless. Well, in the actual fight with Logan, he tried to bully Chris Eubank from the outset, and indeed throughout the bout. He kept putting himself on top of Chris, holding and hitting. Now, previously in Chris's career, he'd never been held and hit like that, and they were really painful, very annoying shots. He also kept hitting Chris on the side of the ear, which again was a really annoying and painful punch for Chris. However, Chris knew quickly that he was technically more a refined fighter. So, in his head, he had this one under control. As usual, he'd studied many tapes of Logan's previous fights, and he'd deduced that he could jab better than Logan could. He could punch better than Logan could, and his style was more artistic. So he was fully charged and irrepressibly enthusiastic about the bout. Now, obviously, if you watch the Logan fight now, you can see that Chris's style is still a little novice-like. His elbows and arms are positioned differently to his more accomplished later stance, where his elbows were much more tightly tucked in. Of course, it was a tough fight, even though Chris knew he had the measure of him. He needed to win this fight, though, so he had to be firing on all cylinders with everything. People in the crowd were shouting for Chris to punch himself out because the pace was very fast, but Chris knew what he was doing. In one of the early rounds, he got caught with a solid left hook, and it was a good shot, and he wobbled from a slight twitch from the nervous system. Then he planted his feet, reset, and carried on, relatively unscathed. Chris said that was his constitution showing even back then. He wasn't going anywhere, even though it was a good shot he received. In the fight, he was completely obdurate, and Logan knew he had his hands full. Sometimes you can actually break a fighter's heart with your own spirit. And we've all seen many good fighters give up on bouts they were winning because the opponent simply wouldn't go down. It just broke their spirit. One of the best tenets that Chris learned in New York was that when you are feeling beaten up, exhausted, and you want to quit, remember that your opponent will feel exactly the same. Now, that is a slice of boxing genius that must be remembered at all times and should be applied to all situations in your life. The Logan fight was the first time Chris was actually being quite vicious, raining blows left and right, followed by uppercuts. Logan was tired, but Chris was unforgiving and ceaseless. He had his focus. By the middle rounds, when he was continuing to hang on Chris Eubank, Chris picked him up and threw him off him so he could start attacking again. In round 8, Chris clipped him on the chin with a perfect shot. It didn't look like it was that powerful, but as he came forward, it actually caught him with a glancing shot. And the reason it was so forceful, Chris says, was because his feet were placed ideally. They pivoted at precisely the correct instant, and so all his body weight was behind the left hook. It wobbled Logan badly, and he would have fallen over if it hadn't have been in front of him to hold him up. Chris had sapped all his power, and because of that almost subversive punch, Logan was desperately holding on. Chris was now fully in charge. Chris said, "At the end of the fight, the referee had to look at the colour of our shorts because when there's two black men, mistakes can and have happened. I was looking at the ref thinking, give it to me. I know I've got this fight. I got the decision, of course, because I had been talking up a clash with Ben within the business. Certain insiders gave me this fight to shut me up. They thought I was just a pretender. Plus, as I hadn't made my name yet, there were bigger money fighters for them to chase than me. They all thought I was a big head. I wasn't big-headed. I just had faith in my abilities." Logan was actually a good example of Chris's method. He had applied his plan, and it had all come together. On paper, that guy was a far better fighter than Chris Eubank, but all the cynics who said that he was naive to take the fight were categorically wrong. He took the fight and he won it. Chris said, "You need to trust yourself. I had to win this bout to get Ben. I did so with true resilience, and I showed I was a genuine candidate. The people who had wanted me to be silenced now had to reassess me. This was a pivotal fight in my career." After the Logan victory, people began to sit up and take notice of Chris. One of those was a certain Barry Hearn, the sports event promoter. Initially, Ronnie Davis was Chris's manager, but then he started this relationship with Barry. Chris said, "We met at the 1989 World Snooker Championships. Barry knew of me, but had not seen me fight live, only on television. We met again at the Grosvenor Hotel to agree our deal, and he later told me I was a vision of a sartorial elegance. My first words to him were, 'Mr. Hearn, I am an athlete, and I know my worth.' I signed a contract with him, which paid me an allowance of £1,200 a month to support me while I was training. And to this day, that contract is incorrect. There were clauses in there that made provision for my career developing. One such point said the terms would be renegotiated if I won the British Commonwealth or European title, by which time I would be earning enough from fights to not need the allowance. Another clause said that the allowance would stop if I was injured for more than 2 months. This was not an eventuality I considered. I was never injured, at least not in a manner that I allowed to interfere. The third and most significant clause of note, and the one that I never agreed with, said that the monthly wage would stop if I lost 2 contests. I told Barry that I wanted to be if I lost 1. He was surprised, and he said, 'Yes, but Chris, what about cut eyes, freak accidents?' 'Come on,' I replied, 'I'm not interested. Barry, if I lose once, you rip that contract up.' When it arrived for signature, however, it still said 2 losses. Now, at first, Barry had Chris work with a manager called Darky Smith, but it didn't really work. He tried to train Chris, but he was never listening because he wasn't the calibre of the trainer that Max Ebel was. From what Chris had witnessed in New York, he knew what he was doing. It was already in his head. It was just about repetition and streamlining it to get it perfect. Darky Smith stopped working with Barry shortly after. In Chris's opinion, you need someone like a Barry Hearn on your side. He knew he was a promoter who could get him the fights that he needed. Chris said it goes beyond being about fights. It begins to start being about getting the championship fights. I had grand ambitions, and Barry Hearn had the know-how to get me the shot I wanted, which was Nigel Benn. Chris also goes on to talk about promoters and managers in his autobiography, and he says this: promoters and managers never really have your interest at heart, or at least not before their own, of course. From 1990 to 1995, Barry Hearn was a huge promoter, the number 1 in the United Kingdom. Why? Because he promoted Chris Eubank. You're only as good as the fighter you have. Don King was only as good as he was because he had Ali, Holyfield, Tyson, boxers like that. If you own the heavyweight champion of the world, then you will be the best promoter in the world. Everyone will have to come to you. I was to become the biggest name in the world boxing, other than the heavyweights, and Barry Hearn became the kingpin. He was the best promoter by far at this time. Now, after beating Logan, Chris won a couple of more points decisions, both at Bethnal Green's York Hall against Frankie Morrow and Randy Smith, both awkward journeymen, slippery veterans who made for rather dull fights. The Randy Smith bout was Barry's first with a promoter with Chris, although there were only about 100 people there. But at the time, Chris was a no-name boxer, so he wasn't really in a position to pull the crowds that he would eventually go on to pull. Then he was scheduled to fight Canadian Les Wisniewski at the International Centre in Brentwood. There was a good undercard of local fighters, and Chris's bout was top of the bill. He was a journeyman boxer who, to Chris at that stage, was just there to make Chris look good. He was willing, but his ability was limited. In Chris's eyes, you mustn't waste any opportunities though, and whatever comes your way, you must know that influential people were keeping an eye on you. And he used that particular bout to show his command of the art, the repertoire and the refinement that he'd learned, and it was one of Chris's favourite performances. He was on song from the very first bell. This was Chris's artistic licence on display. It was pure exhibitionism. He said, "If you watch this fight, you will appreciate the dexterity and complexity of my moves and my punches." I was catching his punches as easily as catching a ball thrown by a child. That allowed me the freedom to shine. All these seemingly silly little shots were so impressive and inspiring to the judges. It was all very deliberate. The objective is to catch the eye of the judges and the people. However, although some of the moves look small and relatively simple, they're actually a result of all those thousands and thousands of hours of repetition that Chris Eubank put in the gym. That sort of poetry in motion doesn't just happen by accident. Chris said, for example, when I circled the ring in this fight, this was not me playing, this was all method. This had all been premeditated and done time and time again. That death sight of foot is not from the roadwork. It's more a product of circling in the gym hundreds of thousands of times. If you don't do it in training, you can't do it in the ring. Even when you're using footwork like that, you need to take care. You are still fighting a professional. Out of 52 professional fights, Chris has probably been on song and been in poetry and motion maybe 15 times. That's what he believes. And this particular bout was one of them. And it was vital that he looked impressive because this was his second fight with Barry Hearn and they were building him towards a world title fight, so he had to show his pedigree. He stopped Wisniewski in the second round. Afterwards, the commentator, Reg Gutteridge, said, "The referee pointing his finger probably caused more damage to Eubank than Les Wisniewski." Inevitably, the people who said that Chris wasn't good enough to fight Logan now said he wasn't taking on fights of sufficient calibre. They were always finding a negative angle, and for Chris, it was just an ideal opportunity to scintillate and make sure that he did. After the bout, they all knew that Chris was serious, and just as importantly, Chris thought, you know what, I've got a future in this sport. He'd just put in a very good performance and got paid well for it. And at the time, it was the richest he'd ever felt. Next, he comfortably beat Ron Malek in 5 rounds at the Festival Hall in Basildon before stopping Jean-Noel Camara at Bethnal Green with a 2-round demolition. He's flying at this point. Even his worst critics had to admit that that was an explosive performance of poetic beauty. Now, the critics knew he could really box. 2 of the next 3 fights for Chris were quite tough. First up was a fella called Johnny Melfa, a fighter of average ability at the Royal Albert Hall. When Chris got in the ring with him, Melfa was playing rather excellent cat and mouse. He was repeatedly getting to Chris and landing some big hard shots. Naturally, Chris had all the style. But he was just out of range and cleverly used this to his advantage. Chris said, "In my career, I was never knocked out, but I did sense what I call the white lights of unconsciousness 3 times. Once was the near miss in the final of the Spanish Golden Gloves, a story that we told earlier, and then another time was in the second Michael Watson fight. And the other occasion was remarkably against Johnny Melfa. Chris knew he was substantially more talented than this man, but credit where credit's due, he landed an enormous right hand that made Chris sense the white lights. Chris said, "I circled around the ring and got myself back together, but he had definitely hurt me. It was a big, powerful shot." Chris then talks about a pivotal moment in this particular fight. Quite an interesting story. He says that Melfa made a mistake. He actually landed a punch that dislodged a tooth of Chris Eubank's, and he really didn't want to lose this particular tooth. The reason he talks about this tooth is when he was in training for the Melfa fight, Errol Christie, who was his sparring partner, had actually dislodged a front tooth with a hefty punch, so he had it splinted in with dental cement and it seemed to be secure, and at the end of the 3rd round, Melfa hit him with an average jab. But for some reason, this repaired tooth, which had already withstood some almighty bombs, was dislodged again. Now this really niggled Chris, and he didn't want to lose that tooth. That put Chris in a devastating frame of mind. If a fighter isn't skilled enough to use raw aggression, then you can come on against him with feverish power, he said. I did that like a man against a baby. I forced myself upon him like thunder. In the 4th, I hit him with a shot that left him concussed. When he hit the ground, his leg bounced. That tooth really niggled me, he said. In my opinion, this fighter had nothing on me, although he had fought at the top level of the British middleweights. He was never really in my class, and it made me angry that this cumbersome spoiler had nearly cost me my tooth. At the finish, I was like a lion after him, breaking his jaw in the process. Chris then moved on from this particular fight, and he travelled to Kirby, where he beat Jose De Silva in 6 rounds. He entered the arena with a much more extravagant show and actually vaulted over the ropes, as usual. Then he stood there, stock still, tapping one glove on top of the other, effortlessly serene. It was quite a show, however, bearing in mind he was supposed to be kept away from southpaws. Imagine the shock when De Silva comes out in that exact stance. Chris's first reaction was to stop the fight. Nobody told him it was going to be a southpaw. He didn't want this fight. Of course, he didn't stop the bout, but instead he slid around the canvas, using his ring savvy and surveyed the territory. He circled away from the right-hand jab of De Silva, controlled his tactics, and hit him extremely hard with every shot he had. It caught up with him in the 6th round, and he stopped him. He'd beaten him with intellect. Of course, you don't just box with your fist, you box with your mind. Mind and fist are better than just fist. That's what Chris thinks. So we move into January 1990, and he now is fighting a fellow called Dennis Cronin in Splot, Cardiff. And Chris tells a story about this particular fight, and also before the bout. He says, before the fight, I was in the men's washroom when Cronin walked in. I'd already used the urinal and was washing my hands. Cronin relieved himself, but made to walk out of the bathroom without washing. I said, "Hey, wash your hands." He swore at me and walked out. I knew then that I'd won that fight. The bout was the perfect example of my relationship with a hostile crowd, a tense interconnection which I made use of throughout my career. In that arena in Cardiff, the hate that poured my way was so fierce you could almost reach out and pluck it from the air. They were salivating for my demise. Apart from my small camp, I'm pretty sure everyone else was against me. If I'd have hit the canvas, the place would have gone ballistic. However, this is what I loved, what I wanted, no, what I craved. You see, let me tell you something about boxing. There is a great deal spoken about fighting in your own backyard, as they say in the business. Get the crowd behind you, lift yourself with the support. I always reverse that psychology. Let me come to your backyard. It's not even that I want to come, I need to come. I don't mind people being against me. Please, all of them at the same time viciously. Chris drew so much energy from hateful crowds, he soaked it up like a sponge. I think the problem for Chris's opponents was that he sucked all the venom in and allowed it to well up inside of him, and it transformed it into positive energy and then unleashed it back against his opponents. And that was what he'd studied with the doctor earlier on in the story about martial arts and the philosophy of it. He'd used that to his advantage throughout certain moments of his career. And you think of the negative vibes that was always thrown over Chris's way over the years, you can imagine with these stories how useful that probably was to him at certain points. The more they hated Chris, the more they energised and devastated he'd become, and the more arrogant he eventually become in the ring. Well, that stoppage of Cronin took the tally of opponents for the previous 12 months to 10, 7 of whom Chris had either knocked out or stopped, and he was keeping really busy. On the 6th of March 1990, he was then lined up for his first title fight for the WBC International Middleweight belt against the durable Argentinian Hugo Corte, again at Bethnal Green's York Hall. Chris was in tremendous shape and he was feeling very confident, plus his focus to earn this first accolade was fierce. And Chris always thought that a belt was only as big as the fighter who actually wears it. That was one of his philosophies. Corte was always going to be in trouble. Chris knocked him down a couple of times and looked to the referee to stop the fight, which he did in the 8th round. Winning the WBC International Middleweight belt was then the good step that Chris needed up the ladder. But he was not about to be flattered into complacency. He had bigger fish to fry in the form of Nigel Benn. After the Corte fight, Doctor arrived in the UK, and that's where they resumed their relationship in the gym together, with Doctor providing him with a welcome colleague, technically, and also a great ally emotionally for him. The next 2 fights for Chris were both in his hometown. The first opponent, Eduardo Contreras, to this day probably took the hardest punches that Chris states he ever delivered to anybody, and actually never went down. Chris would go on to win this fight on points, but the fight itself was significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, it was shown on ITV, whereas previously his bouts had only been screened on Screen Sport, with highlights elsewhere. Secondly, although ITV usually showed a fight from the bell for the first round, the ITV executives in the crowd that night saw that Chris's entrance was something else, and he understood what television that would actually make. Now, although the Contreras fight was on Chris's territory, the boxing crowds were not automatically behind Chris in Brighton. Nevertheless, the next fighter, Kid Milo, was dispatched with aplomb in the 8th round. Following this victory, Chris finally received the news that he'd been waiting for, that he'd been given an opportunity to face Nigel Benn. He knew that this fragment of opportunity had arrived, and after much negotiation, he eventually had to accept a lesser purse of £100,000 compared to Benn's £800,000. But in Chris's mind, all he wanted to do was just get him in the ring. He saw it as a matter of honour, and the point was, what he really wanted was Benn's title. Chris knew the big money was going to come later, And people were already talking up a fight with the winner against Michael Watson or even Thomas Hearns. All this chatting and playing, for Chris, he just wants to get to brass tacks, the fight. Chris says that he always used a point system for his opponents, marking them in advance on a scale of 1 to 10. Nigel Benn got a 10. Chris said, I would then train with that number in mind. You go through identical routines and regimes, but subconsciously I would somehow think harder for a 10 than for a 5. My foremost thought was obviously to become champion of the world and therefore honour the life of solitude that had dominated all my adult years. However, I have always found the extra mileage and motivation in placing material or emotional goals in front of myself during the preparation for a fight. And what he means by that is while he was working towards the Benn title fight, him and Karen went to view a 4-bedroom detached house with a nice garden in Old Shoreham Road. And Chris thought at the time, wow, if we can have this, that'll be it. We'll have arrived. It cost Chris £190,000, which of course is huge money at the time. Simply put, the mathematics of the situation for Chris were that if he didn't beat Nigel Benn, they'd lose our house. It'd be repossessed. And that was a surefire motivator for him. Closer to his heart, though, was Karen. And then we talked about marriage with Karen for some time, but there was no possibility of getting married until he'd proven himself. Now, in other words, he'd made champion. Of course, Karen didn't see it like that. She was with Chris for Chris. However, that was Chris's way of looking at their relationship. So what he actually did, although he didn't realise it at the time, was use Barry and Karen as an actual emotional incentive to win the fight against Nigel Benn. Now, prior to this big fight with Nigel Benn, he had to go through this pre-fight preparation, which he said was meticulous. Now, we'd seen Michael Watson's 6-round victory over Benn at Finsbury Park, and some people suggested that would actually provide Chris with the ideal knowledge on how to beat Benn. In fact, what it actually taught him was how to beat Michael Watson. Benn had punched himself out, but Chris learned how to cover up properly, and if you cover up and keep your hands clenched, you'll get hurt. Watson covered up, but he kept his hands open around his head, fingers on the forehead. His defence that night, as Chris would find out later when they fought each other, was actually staggeringly exceptional. Now, for the last fight before he goes to Nigel Benn, he was up against the Brazilian Ronaldo dos Santos. Now, they kill out for the first round, and Chris, well, he said he was in his zone that night. Very focused. He poleaxed him with a huge right hand. He went down. And that was literally the end of that. It's probably the most famous Chris Eubank knockout. You'll have seen it. I know most of you will have seen it, but it is probably the most famous Chris Eubank knockout that is out there. It was literally just one punch, and it was just so accurate that it took him completely out. Now, although this one-punch knockout had the welcome effect of hyping the Benn fight substantially, after all, Benn was supposed to be the big hitter, Chris hadn't intended to make such a bold statement. He was not so gifted that he could go in and knock a man out intentionally in 20 seconds. And he said it before, I like to work a fight longer than its natural life to gain practice. But that was a strange one. He didn't mean to end it quickly. And you never know how a fight's going to go. But that was the most fantastic advert for a Benn Eubank fight at Birmingham's NEC on the 18th of November, 1990. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to an end of the first part on Chris Eubank's career profile. Perfect way to end the first part, just going in to the first Nigel Benn fight. I hope you've enjoyed it, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed learning so much more about Chris Eubank's life. I think learning the origins of his upbringing was something that I didn't necessarily know the intricate details about. So one of the big sources for this podcast, of course, was Chris Eubank's autobiography. He did quite a few years back, and it had some great stories in there, some of which I've taken and used for this podcast. So if you've read the book, you'll probably be familiar with some of those stories. But also, there's some great articles out there and some great Associated Press reports that were used as source material for this episode. But overall, just being able to learn more about intricate details and stories of his life, it really sets up the scene for part 2, where we go into that first Nigel Benn fight. Of course, we've got the second fight, the Michael Watson fights, and then we start to move in to the 90s, the big part of the 90s, where boxing's really starting to take off again in the UK. So I'm really excited to get part 2 ready for you as well. And if you've enjoyed this first part of Chris Eubank's Career Profile. As always, please do let me know. If you're on Spotify, please make sure you leave a comment. It's really easy to do so. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and a review if this has been an episode that's really brought you into this world. If you are on social media and you're following us across social media, either on Instagram or on Facebook or even on TikTok, please make sure you leave a comment on any of the literature or any of the videos that are put out about this particular episode. And if you've listened to this podcast on YouTube, please make sure you leave a comment below. I do genuinely appreciate the support and the feedback to help make these episodes better over time. So please continue to do that. Really looking forward to getting part 2 out to you guys. So thank you as always for continuing to come back to me with different recommendations and different fighters that you want me to cover. And I hope you've really enjoyed this. For those that have been supporting me through Patreon, I want to say thank you. I hope you've enjoyed having early access to it. And of course, ad-free, so there's no interruptions from the ads that you get through all the podcasting apps out there. If you're not a patron and you can support us in any way, shape or form, please go and have a look at the relevant tiers on Patreon. And there is Patreon-only content on there for those that are relatively new to it. For those that are existing, long-standing patrons, I imagine you'll have listened to absolutely everything on there right now. But the intention is to bring some more new, fresh material to you guys. So if that's of interest to you guys that are listening that are not patrons, please go and check us out on patreon.com. Please continue to support us over social media. We really do appreciate it. And that is it for this first part of Chris Eubank's Career Profile. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you next time on the BTR Boxing Podcast Career Profiles.